So, Mark, if I recall correctly, we met for the first time 10 years ago in Colombia, in Cartagena, in a sustainability event organized by the IFC. And back then, you were only starting FNMPC with Nilo Edwards. And 10 years later, you have a membership of 180 First Nations. You support many of them negotiating equity deals in projects over $100 million.
Yes.
What made FNMPC come to life? And what's the explanation for this amazing growth in 10 years?
Approximately 10 years ago, here in the province of British Columbia, which is where I'm calling you from, there were 11 Indigenous communities, First Nations, that's what we call ourselves here, who negotiated a 30% equity stake or ownership of a natural gas pipeline. The pipeline was valued at $5 billion. But what the communities quickly discovered is that because we do not have assets, we have rights to land, but we don't own the land, it's held in trust by the government. Those communities could not access capital. They could not get the money needed to invest in the 30%. So they lost the opportunity. The community leaders and chiefs at that time thought this is going to happen again. We needed an Indigenous organization that understood the problem, mainly how to access money at an affordable rate for investment, and then also how to structure our communities to work in a commercial structure with other communities. They started the coalition, 11 nations, 11 communities, but as you pointed out, it's grown to 184. So that is 1/3 of all the Indigenous communities in Canada. So that is where the coalition has started. And as you pointed out, we have grown and grown. So the coalition has two main functions for Indigenous communities or Indigenous nations. What we do in Canada is that we promote the environmental values of Indigenous communities to be incorporated in the project and the economic interests. Economics, essentially, as you pointed out, is not a grant. We will provide services to communities to co-invest. The challenge for many Indigenous communities is we do not have a lot of money in the communities. So how do you find that money? So what we do is that we will help the communities access lower priced capital money, usually through a loan guarantee program. It's creative and it's done differently in every case. Two of the main instruments that Indigenous communities here will use to access capital was one, the loan guarantee program. The reason, as I mentioned earlier, is that we do not own our assets. Our lands are held in trust by the government that we use, but because of that, we do not have titles. We cannot use that as collateral. What the loan guarantee program is essentially the government guaranteeing that if the payments aren't made on a loan, that they will pay the loan. But what that does is it reduces the risk and the cost of capital. So it'll be almost the same cost as government borrowing. There is also in Canada another group called the First Nations Financial Authority. And what it does is that it will evaluate the cash flows that will come from a project. So for example, if it's an electric transmission line or a solar energy plant, and they know that the revenues over 25 years are a certain amount, they can issue a bond for that revenue in future years, and they sell those bonds in Toronto and New York to non-Indigenous investors because non-Indigenous investors want the stable cash flows, either for pension funds or other investors. They have raised over they've raised billions of dollars right now for Indigenous communities who then take that money and then invest it in the project so they can then access the future cash flows. Those are the two main instruments being used right now.
What is it with energy projects that makes it so attractive for Indigenous people to participate as equity partners?
In Canada, you were right, 85% of the projects that come to us are clean energy. And the reasons for that are two reasons. One of them is that a clean energy project is usually more compatible with our Indigenous values. They're also easier to finance. They tend to be smaller. They also have usually a guaranteed purchaser of the energy for 25 years. We also then have a regulated return.
Let's focus a little bit on what the communities need internally to participate in these projects, because I guess it requires some changes in how you're organized. You need to strengthen certain capacities. You need to separate politics from business. What are your key recommendations for a community that wants to do this for the first time?
So, number one, capacity of the indigenous communities. Second, access to affordable capital, affordable money for co-investing. The third one, as you pointed out, is governance. Most indigenous communities in Canada are not organized in a commercial structure. We are organized as regional governments or sometimes as nonprofit societies. But to move to an agreement with a bank or a financial institution, the bond markets, and with companies, we needed to start setting up structures that those groups would recognize and would have the capability to enter business agreements. So those 3 points.
And so what's a competitive advantage for companies to actually partner with indigenous communities in equity deals?
So what we're finding here in Canada is that companies who understand that it's a competitive advantage to have an indigenous co-owner, a co-proponent, an investor, is that it makes it easier for them to get the project built. If you have an indigenous party that is opposed to the project, very few other investors want to invest in that company. Some companies have realized that if they can get an indigenous partner first, upfront, that does two things. It speeds up the permitting of the project because the government realizes there's not going to be opposition from the indigenous party. If you were an indigenous co-investor in a project, why would you oppose your own investment? The second thing that happens is other investors realize, oh, if I can invest in a project over here, which has indigenous parties, will be built on time and maybe under budget, and will produce revenue sooner than a project over here, which does not have an indigenous party, so it has more risk, they'll go that way. The third thing in competitive advantages is some companies have realized if they go into an area and they can secure the partnership of the indigenous party as a co-investor, that indigenous party will not invest with a competitor in that same region. And so what you're finding is some companies have realized that if they can do this, they basically block other companies from coming into the area for 20, 25, 30 years. So for those reasons, you're starting to see an increasing number of partnership discussions happening because it's become a commercial discussion, not just indigenous rights, but commercial. And that has been what has been the greatest success of the coalition. There's also a side of this is how, as indigenous people, we speak about the values that the investors want to see at the same time that protects what we're after. So it's that bridging between the indigenous values, commercial values, and how they make money at the same time as we achieve our self-determination goals. And sometimes we have to learn as indigenous people how to speak capital markets, how to speak financial terms, how to speak time delay. It's up to us as indigenous people then to make that bridge to that world because engineers are not very good at coming our way.
So you recently visited Argentina last year. We were there in Buenos Aires for a week. You had the patience to speak to 9 different groups, make slightly different presentations to all of them. Um, and I wanted to ask you, based on your impressions from that visit and your previous visit to Colombia and Cartagena 10 years ago, uh, does this remind you of where Canada was in, maybe 20 or 30 years ago?
It did. What was fascinating is meeting indigenous people in those two countries is that we share the same desires, outcomes, hopes in terms of participating in projects that provide the cash flow that allow us as indigenous peoples to make decisions for our futures. 20 years ago in Canada, the federal government made all our decisions for us. They told us where we would go to school, what education we would do. We were often told, no, there's never been an example of Indigenous people co-owning any business project, so stop asking. The big change in Canada did not come directly from government. It came from investors because investors started to realize, hey, we want to see our money put somewhere that isn't harming people, that isn't harming the environment. And they started to pressure on companies and governments to do things differently. What I saw in South America is that investors are starting to ask the questions that we asked 20 years ago about how is this project being built? Is it fair? Is it just to the host communities who have the land? Is there a way to ensure that our investment benefits not only our investors, but the local people? I think what's interesting about this conversation that we're having, even, this is indigenous people in one part of the world speaking to indigenous people in another part of the world, willing to share the information, the examples, and in many cases, even the investors, the names of the investors, because we as indigenous people in Canada will never be in competition with indigenous people in South America, but we share the same objectives. So as a coalition of indigenous people, we share all our experience with other indigenous people. So be creative, don't be shy. Somebody somewhere in the indigenous world is facing the same problem, the same challenge, and they'll share that information with you.